It's time to acknowledge, treat, train, and fuel women as the different physiological beings that they are. That's the assertion from today's expert edition featured guest, Dr. Stacy Sims. Dr. Stacy Sims has coined the mantra, "Women are not small men." And she states that it's apparent that sex differences extend far beyond ponytails and sports bras. Find out more on today's expert edition.
Hi, I'm Dr. Stacy Sims. I am the author of Roar and a female athlete expert in performance and health. And you're listening to the Physical Performance Podcast.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Physiocram and Pogo Physio. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll aim to bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. We do this across a range of different episodes, expert editions, featured performers, coaches' corners, and interest editions. And on today's episode, it is an expert edition featuring a very heavily requested guest, leading global expert on female physiology and endurance training, Dr. Stacy Sims. Perhaps Stacy is best known for her work in coining the phrase, "Women are not small men." Stacy Sims has spent the last 2 decades researching female physiology so as to optimize women's training, nutrition, recovery, and hydration needs. And it's all based on that premise that women are not small men. Dr. Stacy Sims is the author of Roar: How to Match Your Food and Fitness to Your Female Physiology for Optimum Performance, Great Health, and a Strong, Lean Body for Life. It is a must-read book, not only for female athletes, but also any males in their corner. Health professionals, fitness professionals, or anyone that values helping others perform at their own physical best. I have devoured the pages of Roar, and it largely serves as a platform for our discussion and deep dive into all things female physiology and endurance training. By way of bio, Dr. Stacy Sims has contributed to the exercise physiology and sports nutrition fields for more than 2 decades, as not only a scientist but also an athlete. Stacy served as an exercise physiologist and nutrition scientist at Stanford University from 2007 to 2012, specialising in sex differences of environmental and nutritional considerations for recovery and performance. Stacy has also been an athlete, an elite one herself, with an extensive experience working also with athletes from all levels, beginners right through to Olympians and Tour de France caliber cyclists. In 2012, Dr. Stacy Sims left her full-time academic position at Stanford University to start her own consultancy practice and to further the dissemination of science into the real-world applications for athletes, coaches, educators, and colleagues. And on today's expert edition, we will explore female athlete physiology across the lifespan. We discuss menopause, pregnancy, menstruation 101, the oral contraceptive pill, exercise, recovery, fueling for the female athlete, all around the different phases of the menstruation cycle. And Dr. Stacy Sims answers some pre-provided listener questions. This is an expert edition you are going to want to take notes from and also likely hit replay on several times. Get ready with a pen and paper. Here is Dr. Stacy Sims on all things female physiology and endurance training. Dr. Stacy Sims, before we press record, I shared that I've been looking forward to this for a long time. You first sprung to attention in the treatment room at the Super League Triathlon Series where a bunch of the female triathletes were enthusiastically raving about your body of work. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to have a bit of a chat. It's cool.
Well, I think it'll be a bit more than a chat because there's so much that I feel you've got to offer the listenership of this show, and your background, just to put a bit of perspective beyond the bio I shared, it's been quite rich and varied. You yourself were an athlete, a triathlete, an iron distance athlete, a dancer. Can you just, with broad brushstrokes, bring us into the picture of how you got to now follow the niche work that you do, the release of Raw, your popular TED Talk, etc.?
That's a good question. I don't know. It stems from being a kid and always asking why, like asking why this, why that, and now it's coming back on me because my kid does the same to me. But throughout my athletic endeavors, I had all these questions and they were never answered. So I was able to be fortunate enough to have some really good mentor female professors, actually, who was like, don't stop asking why. You have the opportunity to go through academia and get these questions answered. And I think the turning point really was being a rower at Purdue University, undergrad, being on the crew team and training lightweight girls and lightweight boys. And we were following the same training program, same tapering, but there were times where our boat just wasn't responding like the boys. And we're like, well, what's going on? It was at the same time as getting into ex-phys and started asking the questions in ex-phys. And they're like, yeah, well, we don't really know. Women are anomalies. There's no real difference. And that was like, no, wait a second. There is a difference. And so that started the real inquisitive nature of, well, this isn't working for me. This isn't working for my teammates. What's the answer? I don't like that answer. And, when you're like 18 to 20, you think you know everything, even though you don't. So you really push the boundaries. And then that kind of fostered where I went with my career. And as an athlete, being able to get into some of the higher ranks, like with bike racing and stuff, and working with the pros after I retired from bike racing and still getting their questions. And then applying some of the stuff that I had researched and known. And when I was at Stanford, I worked with Marcia Stefanik, who was the head of the Women's Health Initiative, and she wanted to do some comparisons between older and younger women. So there's a lot of things that came together from different fields where I was able to pull from these different fields and focus it in and say, hey, wait a second, there's this big chunk of information that isn't being disseminated, but there's also this big dearth of information that needs to be answered. And yeah, that's how I got here.
It's interesting that you said that the drivers were someone encouraged you to keep being inquisitive, to keep asking questions, to not settle with the status quo. And it sounds like it's that same inquisitiveness that drives you to this day. But what else drives you? I mean, you're prolific. You're an author, a published scientist. What is it that drives you? What's the key message, Stacey, that if you could just disseminate it to every woman on the planet right now, what would that key message be?
It's empowerment with a bigger voice, because I work with a really fantastic sociologist here as well, and understanding cultural context as well as the physiological context. And you can't just be siloed. Like, I can be out there talking about low energy availability and RED-S and how you can train appropriately to prevent it. But if you don't understand where a woman is coming from and how that may or may not empower her, your voice is a bit flat. So you're looking at the community of people who want to help women achieve their performance potential, be it a 5K run, be it fit enough to play with their kid who's growing up, So all the way up to Olympic athletes, because everyone has that drive or that want to get the best out of themselves. And for so long, we've been sitting back and just following things that have been given to us, like an internet program. You sign up for this, lose whatever kind of weight, or going to a gym, getting a personal trainer, and paying all this money trying to achieve that performance potential, but missing the mark. And for me, I look at women who are like beating themselves up trying to get fit or achieve their potential because they're not achieving it because they're following some male-driven program. And if we can bring everybody together and have this community of both men and women talking about, hey, there's these sex differences, and we can really get more out of our female population if we just acknowledge it and train them differently.
So acknowledge it, one, and train them differently, two. And I must, confess, if you like, that as a 14-year experienced sports physio who's been around endurance sports for 25 years from, the age of 11 onwards, in preparing for this and reading Raw, I was revisiting Physiology 101 about the women's cycle, things that you learn at university, but yet day to day, week to week in work, I'm working with bone stress injuries and considering energy availability, of course, and cycles. It's a common conversation these days, but up until several years ago, it wasn't. And, and I'd like to think I try and stay on the front end of evidence-based practice, but it actually alarms me as to the relative ignorance. So it must absolutely drive you to frustration, desperation at times.
Yeah, I've been doing this for 20 some odd years, and it's really just in the past 3 that people have really pushed it forward. You're seeing more and more research articles coming out, the consideration of things like concussion recovery and the sex differences in concussion recovery. Why do women take longer? And their, ACL injury, why is it more prevalent in young girls, 14 to 19 years old? And so these questions have been around, but now people are wanting to answer them, and they're trying to do the scientific design in a proper way to get the answers. And I think it's the globalization. I don't want to say the Me Too movement, but part of that is, the empowerment of women. You're seeing people like Serena Williams come out and say, yeah, I was pregnant and my performance suffered, but now I have this beautiful daughter and I'm coming back, and all these changes happen in my body. And 5 years ago, none of that would have come out because it was so taboo. But now I think the conversation is easier to be had, and you're seeing it not only from media and magazines and that kind of stuff, but you're also seeing it in the research world. Yeah,
and I like how you challenge audiences when you're presenting live to say the word period.
Yeah, exactly.
I challenge therapists, if you've got a female athlete in front of you that's got a bone stress injury and you're not having a conversation about their cycle, you should leave the room.
Yeah, exactly.
How can you help? How can you expect to help? So I love at the start of Raw, Stacey, where you say this. I went to work researching how hormones impact thermoregulation, macronutrient usage, hydration, performance and recovery. Right out of the gate, it was apparent that sex differences extended far beyond ponytails and sports bras. So you said a moment ago, acknowledging it, step one. Just in broad brushstrokes, can you paint some of the sex differences physiologically from males to females?
Oh, broad brushstrokes.
or not so broad.
Yeah, I was going to say, so estrogen and progesterone are really thought to be like the inherent reproductive hormones, but they affect every system of the body, from increasing your core temperature in the high hormone phase. Progesterone increases more total body sodium losses, thirst sensation changes. We even know inherently in endurance exercise, there's a difference across the board of fuel utilization between men and women doing the same type of exercise, and like recovery differences. Women come back down to baseline a lot sooner, and things like plasma volume changes and blood volume changes across the menstrual cycle. Things like brain fog that comes up because estrogen is affecting serotonin and tryptophan. So there's so many things that people just generalize as, oh, well, you're a woman and you're PMS and you're going to be moody and anxious. And people are like, well, why am I? And they just accept it. Well, it's because these hormones are affecting every system in the body. So I would say that almost every stereotype you have of a woman somehow was based or entrenched in a hormonal or physiological response. And
there's so much we could delve into there on the sex differences, and I'd encourage listeners, grab your copy of Raw, the book, and explore them in detail. But you mentioned there that there's an acceptance and a generalization of some of these effects that you just mentioned there, Stacey. So I guess you're challenging convention by saying it doesn't have to be accepted, rather you can optimize a woman's performance around their physiology.
Exactly. And with an eye to Tokyo, right, everyone's doing all this heat research. But I have seen very limited studies coming out that are specific to the female athletes. But we know from a study 2 years ago, it was published by, I think her first name was Cynthia, her last name is Me, that women need a primer. They need to be exposed to heat first to drive the temperature up a bit. and then exit the heat and then go back in order to get these same adaptations that men get just by being in. So there are small little subtle effects because your core temperature and all your thresholds of thermoregulation change across the menstrual cycle. So if you're in the low hormone phase where those changes haven't occurred, your body needs a little bit of a stimulus to actually turn up and get responsive to heat exposure. And when you're looking at the standard protocols right now for acclimation to heat and humidity, they're all based on the male model, where the women aren't getting the cardiovascular boosts of blood volume or getting the thermoregulatory changes and shifts in sweating onset because they're not doing the right protocol for their physiology.
Just to get clear on that, Stacey, so interesting, the right protocol. Could you just practically share what might be a better way to prepare a female athlete for, say, the rigours of the heat in Tokyo, the Olympic Games? Did you mention there that it was putting them in and then pulling them out of heat rather than just leaving them in there?
Yeah, so a standard protocol really is 5 days, 1 off, 5 days on. So that's going in short-term heat acclimation. You go in, you do 90 minutes of low to moderate activity just to get that heat stress. And in men, we know that it changes onset of sweat, it increases blood volume, get all these cardiovascular and thermoregulatory changes. If a woman does that, then she comes out and she pretty much is flat. She has a little bit more of a sympathetic drive to start to keep that onset of sweating going, but other than that, nothing. So we know that for women, they need a longer time without that break. So it's more like 3 by 5. And in that 3 by 5, they go in for 5 minutes, drive the core temperature up, come out, sit down passively, and then go back into the heat chamber and do up to an hour of that same activity because they need that stimulus to reset and get everything like optimized to really adapt to the heat. So then they'll get the same cardiovascular benefits. They'll get the same sweat threshold shifts. They'll get the same vasodilatory shifts. And I mean, I've seen people going to Kona as well and trying to acclimatize with the sauna. And over the course of a few years, they're like, this isn't working. And you change it up and they're like, hey, wait a second, I'm much better this year. What's going on?
You change the protocol up and
yeah.
So interesting. And once again, it's all driven by the underlying premise that women are not small men. They have different physiology.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
I was actually interested, Stacey, in working through RAW and looking at the section on going to extremes where you do lay out some of this adaptation to heat stress for the female athlete. But you also mention altitude acclimation. And I recently just returned from 10,000 feet in Ethiopia where I got in there and did too much too soon and got mountain sickness. So I came back down and back on the Gold Coast, Australia at zero metres of elevation. But I was really interested. Can you outline the differences that women experience at altitude than men when it comes to training? Because I found this fascinating.
By the nature of going to altitude, especially if you go in the high hormone phase, which is more difficult, your respiratory drive is elevated because there's an increased sympathetic drive due to progesterone, just kind of increasing metabolism across the board. There's also the factor that estrogen spares glycogen, so you can't really access carbohydrate very well. So when you first go to altitude, the primary factor is an increased respiratory drive and increased reliance on carbohydrate, and you become dehydrated through increased respiration and the drier air. So women who go to altitude in the high hormone phase without any kind of prep are more predisposed to asthma and altitude sickness because they're already in that elevated state and they can't access the carbohydrate that their body needs to kind of decrease and say, okay, I'm a little bit out of sort, but I can handle it. And so one of the precursors before going to altitude, you can use heat to increase blood volume so that when you get to altitude, your body's not quite so stressed. And then the other aspect is men will suffer more at the fitter they are because they rely more on oxygen carrying capacity because they have a greater hemoglobin content versus women. So women, when they go and they're training, they don't have as much of an effect at that high end that men do.
Yeah, so some very distinct differences. And so if someone was going to altitude to train as a female athlete, you might have them obviously being aware of and informed, as you say, acknowledging what part of their cycle they're in, the high or the low hormone phase, and adjusting nutrients in accordance, but then also what maybe I think you mentioned jumping in the sauna. Would a sauna help prepare?
Yeah, exactly. Because everyone responds to heat. Not everyone responds to altitude. But if you're going into the heat and you're decreasing the partial pressure of oxygen at the level of the kidney, which is what heat stress and dehydration do, it stimulates an increase in EPO and plasma volume. So that's the basis of going into the sauna, is to increase total blood volume. So you have greater water in the blood as well as circulating red cells, so more hemoglobin available, so that when you get to altitude, you have more water available for that water loss, and you also have more iron or hemoglobin available for that oxygen carrying capacity. So you don't suffer as much when you first go to altitude.
Absolutely brilliant. Any specific protocols, Stacey, getting real practical on saunas?
Not an infrared one.
yeah, exactly.
You need to go in there. So the typical one is going in passively dehydrated from either at the end of the day, because everyone is pretty much passively dehydrated, or after a low to moderate exercise session. So you don't totally rehydrate. And you go in and you sit high, and then you come down low, and don't spend more than 20, 25 minutes in there. And don't gulp down the fluid afterwards, because if you gulp down the fluid, then you kill that stimulus. You want to slowly rehydrate over the course of 3 to 4 hours to keep that partial pressure low from that dehydrated state.
Wow. So don't hydrate immediately after getting out of the sauna.
Yeah.
Take 3 or 4 hours. In the words of Donald Trump, Stacey, I think you're a super mega genius.
Oh, geez, okay.
No, look, this is fascinating. I have to ask. I sat in a sauna at altitude with your New Zealand Kiwi athlete there, Zane Robertson. So what would be the effects of sitting in a sauna at altitude? Just magnified again. He's adapted, obviously. Lives there.
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
It's fascinating.
I wouldn't do it. That sounds like hell to me.
I was a bit knocked around when I got out, don't you worry. Stacey, this is fascinating. Let's just touch on, if we can, this Physiology 101 around the female cycle. You mentioned a few times the high hormone phase, the low hormone phase. Can you just touch on a little bit of the cycle, which, as you've outlined in Raw, can be 28 to 35 days long, broken into those two phases?
Yeah, so when we look textbook-wise, they say that a cycle's 28 days. So for the ease of explaining, I'll stick to the 28-day. Day 1 is the first day of bleeding, where estrogen and progesterone have dropped and they're relatively low. And so if you were to do a research study, you could compare a woman to a man, sort of, I guess, because we're more like men in the low hormone phase. Yeah. Then around day 13, you have a luteinizing hormone surge, which precedes that rise in estrogen for ovulation. So around day 13, 14 of ovulation, estrogen starts to come down a little bit, progesterone starts to rise. So from day 14-ish to around day 21 is the early luteal phase. And then from 21 to 20 or 22 to 28 is the late luteal phase, or the high hormone phase. So we look at how estrogen and progesterone come up from that baseline of the low hormone. It's all about the reproductive aspects, because you have ovulation. Ovulation stimulates progesterone coming up, because progesterone prepares the endometrial lining for implantation. If there isn't an egg that's implanted, then you have an inflammatory response that causes the shedding of the lining, and then that's day 1 again. You start bleeding. And you'd be surprised at how many women don't understand that. They don't understand that an OC isn't on an oral contraceptive pill, that the period isn't a period, it's a withdrawal bleed. And you are stagnant in your hormone profile when you're on an OC. Or that an IUD, you still have your own natural cycle, but it's a little bit offset because of the progestin or the copper that interferes with some of the progesterone effects.
So you've got the two phases. Obviously, there's high hormone phase, low hormone phase. There's physiological differences that happen in each of those phases that are distinct, that will affect performance, they'll affect health. And, it's all written about in full in Raw. But then you mentioned the oral contraceptive pill. And I must admit, I'm being very challenged by this and how it affects things as a health practitioner, an experienced health practitioner, dealing with bone stress injuries, often in female runners of all ages, and how this fits in. So let's go there now if we can, Stacey. You mentioned that, you know, if someone's on the pill, a bleed is not a true period, it's a withdrawal bleed. So how's the body responding to the pill? What's it actually doing?
So when you're using what we call a monophasic pill, so that's 3 weeks of the same amount of estrogen and progestin, so your 3 weeks of active pills, you're downregulating your own natural hormones. So you're not having your own estradiol and progesterone. You're not ovulating. It's flatlining and downregulating everything. So you have this high level of synthetic hormone, and then all of a sudden you take your sugar pill and it drops off. And in that sugar pill week, you have a rebound effect of luteinizing hormone trying to get your body's own estrogen progesterone back up. So that sugar pill week really is not a low hormone week, despite what people think. That withdrawal bleed is not a comparative low hormone at all because of the half-life of these hormones. The other aspect that people forget is that the estrogen and progestin of the monophasic OC exerts 500 times the effect on a cellular level than your own endogenous hormones. So when we look from a performance perspective, we see that your anaerobic capacity and ability to adapt to anaerobic capacity and sprint capacity is muted, is attenuated, up to 11%, depending on how fit you are. Your VO2 max and your VO2 peak are also attenuated, because with that elevation of estrogen, you can't access carbohydrate very well, so you can't hit the higher intensities. But also, it has a muting effect on your iron and your oxygen carrying capacity. So that whole oxygen delivery for VO2 max is compromised. When we think about bone, a lot of girls are put on and a lot of women are put on a pill for bone density issues. But we know that the OC doesn't instigate the IGF factor 1 that you need for bone health. And so, like, if you're looking at the different formulations, a lot of the times a girl will go in when she's 14 or 15 with irregular periods or bad skin. They're put on this OC, but it masks so many things and it impedes performance across the board. So if it was up to me, I'd be like, everyone stay off the pill until we see what your baseline is. And then if you need to go on some kind of synthetic hormone for specific health reasons like PCOS or endometriosis, then there's a reason for it. There are other options for contraception besides an oral contraceptive pill. The IUD, copper, or the Mirena with a little bit of progestin, it's listed in the top 200 medications by WHO as being like one of the top ways to prevent pregnancy, because there is no user error once it's inserted. The technique now has come so far from even 5 years ago, so a lot of the side effects that you hear about it aren't there. If you don't want to do an insertion like that, you can use the progestin-only pill, which has the minimal effects on performance and health. But the biggest thing about the OC for me is how it masks endocrine dysfunction. So if someone's in low energy availability and they're on a pill, you're not going to find out if they're amenorrheic. You're not going to find out if their luteinizing hormone isn't surging, because all that's already downregulated by the pill.
Yeah, and I probably need to sit in silence for a while and just absorb it, because it just, to me, just is so perplexing how, bone health, bone stress injuries, how was prescribing the pill ever meant to help bone health when it downregulates the hormones that are the very things that promote bone health?
I know, exactly. And people are like, oh, well, when you look at the history of the pill, it's the estradiol or the ethylene estradiol. It's close enough to the natural hormone that we shouldn't worry. But when you look specifically at the molecular structure, the hydroxyl group is different. And that's very key on some of the physiological effects. So this is why, if you have low bone density, it's more using a patch, because going through the skin and the formulation of the estrogen through the patch is different hydroxyl configuration than what you're taking in an OC. So it doesn't downregulate, it doesn't interfere with IGF-1, so you can actually increase bone density.
Okay, so there are alternatives, and you mentioned the good viable alternatives for birth control, which is presumably a lead-in reason that females and athletes might end up on the pill.
No, for the most part. Like, we just finished a national survey here in New Zealand on it, and most people go on the pill because either they're told to or they want to manipulate their cycles. And then the third reason is for birth control option. Okay,
so told to, 1, manipulate cycles, 2, birth control, 3. Told to, obviously this is from a health professional, and 2, manipulate the cycle, with what outcome hopefully being achieved? Is that for the irregular patterns or?
No, to manipulate their cycle so they don't have a bleed during a major competition.
Okay.
Because there's that perpetual myth that if you're having your period that you're at a performance disadvantage. But we know that that's when you can perform optimally. When estrogen, progesterone drop off, you don't have as much inflammation. Some women feel good the day before, some the day of, and some the day after. It just depends on how long it takes for those hormones to come down. But when you're on the pill, to manipulate your cycle so you don't have a bleed, you leave so much performance potential on the table. It's crazy.
And you have said that your period's an ergogenic aid.
Yeah.
Can be.
Yeah.
Wow. And then I think about, the need to pick up for female athletes, and not just female athletes, but male athletes, of course, as well. But if an athlete is in a state of low energy availability, which we've explored on prior expert editions of this show, not just for performance, but the health benefits, of course. And that's difficult enough because, yes, there's screening tools like, you outline in Raw, your book. There's secondary indicators. I often send the female athlete for blood tests to look at their density if there's a repeat history. But then when the blood tests come back with sex hormones and it's a question of is the pill involved, it's really difficult.
I know, it's like a moot point. You're like, well, I can't make a call here on what's happening with your LH because you're on a pill that's not allowing your body to have that LH surge. It's a bit frustrating.
Wow. So, okay. And then if we talk about the prevalence or the, just how much of an impact low energy availability is for athletes, female athletes out there and male athletes, but the female athlete side of things, Stacey, can you share, I know you've quoted some statistics in some of your work prior around the prevalence of states of low energy availability for female athletes?
Yeah, I mean, it's so endemic and widespread, even in the recreational athletic population. We know that between 45 and 50% of recreational female athletes are in a state of low energy availability. When you look at the upturn of training in elites, most of them will start that upturn in training in an energy balance, and then after 3 or 4 weeks are fully in low energy availability because of the fact of intensity and increased training, muting the appetite, not being able to eat enough. So it's very pervasive. And a short bout of it you can recover from, but the long-term consequences of it is massive. And you'll see girls and women who are performing well to a point, and you know that they're in low energy, or they're starting to have irregular cycles, they might even be amenorrheic, but then they hit that tipping point, boom, down the other side. It takes years to come back, if they come back at all. Whereas they're like ticking along, their performance is going up, and they're like, well, there's nothing wrong with me, but I don't have my period. It's like, yes, hold on, hold that thought, right? So my big thing this past year and a half has been working with a lot of professional female athletes who have a contract they can't break, but they still have to perform, yet they're in this low energy state, in this amenorrheic state. And so I work closely with the coaches to change the training and change that delta, that negative, to a bit more of a positive energy availability, and they get their periods back and their performance just keeps going up. So it's possible to be in energy availability in a positive state and perform really well. And a lot of people just don't put that nutrition factor into. It's not about calories in, calories out. It's about fueling for what you're doing so that you can get those adaptations and maintain endocrine health. Because as soon as your endocrine health hits the bottom, other people, old school, it's overtraining or adrenal fatigue. But we know that that's not what it is. It is this effect of low energy availability. And
it can be so subtle. It's obviously there's, eating disorders which can intentionally, calorie restriction to try and, you've come from a professional cycling background as one of many things you've done where, that myth that weight is the enemy, which is true to a certain point, but then there's a tipping point where it starts to negatively affect performance and health. But, there's the notion that my weight's stable, therefore I mustn't have a problem with my fueling. Yet when I've thought about this over recent years, and really having to lean into this with my physiotherapy work, if you have an athlete that's doubled their training time, say, from just, 5 hours a week to 10 hours, doesn't that necessitate that there needs to be a doubling of intake of nutrients?
Yeah, you would think, right?
Yeah, but how often do we double that? It's,
I know. And it's really, really difficult for athletes to get their head around that all of a sudden they have to have an extra 1,000 or 1,200 calories a day. They're like, what? That's a massive, huge meal. And we know that if you can shut down the breakdown state in and around training, that even if you are in a somewhat low energy state, you don't get the negative ramifications. It's when you stay in that catabolic state, especially after training, you have a big hole of no food coming in, and you have that elevated cortisol, that elevation in your whole sympathetic drive, then that's what really puts your body in that survival mode that triggers the lowering of your resting metabolic rate, thyroid dysfunction, subsequent endocrine dysfunction of menstrual cycle. So when we're working with athletes, it's like, yeah, we know that 1,000 calories is a big thing to put in, but let's just look at what training you're doing. Let's make sure that each training session you fuel for it, you recover from it, and then we'll work on increasing the calorie intake over the course of time. And it helps keep them on the positive side of things instead of tipping over.
You're listening to Dr. Stacy Sims on this an expert edition exploring all things female physiology and endurance training. Support for today's show comes from Physiocrem. Physiocrem is a topical massage cream containing natural plant-based ingredients, ideal for the temporary relief of muscular aches and pains. If you're conscious of what you put on your body, you'll be happy to know that Physiocrem does not contain parabens or hydroxybenzoates, and its non-greasy formula doesn't leave any sticky residue behind. Physiocrem can be found Australia-wide at your local Coles, chemist or health store, as well as via their online shop. They've offered listeners of the Physical Performance Show 20% off the entire range simply by using the coupon code POGO, P-O-G-O, over at physiocrem.com.au. That's physiocrem.com.au. Hurting Sucks and Physiocrem have got your back. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio. We exist to simply help you get back to your physical best following injury. We want everyone who walks through the doors of Pogo Physio to complete their rehabilitation, get back to their physical best, and in doing so, cross their physio finish line. To find out more about Pogo Physio's award-winning services, including our very popular telehealth physiotherapy services that allow for physiotherapy sessions to be conducted worldwide, jump over to pogophysio.com.au. For now, let's jump back with this week's expert edition featuring Dr. Stacy Sims, author of Raw, on all things female physiology and endurance training. Stacy, can you speak to, the subset of people who are trying to actively lose weight, whether it's for aesthetics, recreational athletes, perhaps there's, which we know in recent times with very public cases such as Mary Cain, there can be overt pressures from coaches and society. Yeah. But, can you speak to the athlete that's been calorie restricting, i.e. reducing their intake of nutrients with the hope of losing weight, but is paradoxically storing weight and not really having the effect that you'd think that would have? Can you speak to that situation, what's happening and what that athlete might be better to do?
Yeah, have you just come into the door of my office? Because that tends to be almost everyone that I see.
I'm literally in the door of your office, but no, I haven't come through it.
Oh, okay. One of the biggest things is the whole fasting and the low carb, high fat thing, right? So we have a lot of women and men too, because LEA is prevalent in men as well. They'll do a fasted training session, or they'll delay intake till, lunchtime after they do a morning session in the hopes of losing weight. But again, it's not that in an athletic scope, or when you're adding in exercise, calorie in, calorie out is not a total metric for losing weight. We have to look at the stress that exercise is putting on. And if you get into that state where you're not taking in enough carbohydrate or other macronutrients to support just basic resting metabolic rate, your body goes into this survival mode and starts storing a lot of belly fat. So you're like, what's going on? I'm eating less, I'm training harder, but I'm putting on belly fat. That right there, when someone comes in and tells me that, I don't have to do an in-depth analysis of what they're eating or what they're training. I'm like, you're in low energy. Like, that is one of the first signs that your body's not getting enough, when it starts storing extra abdominal fat, because it is a very active fat, and it's a visceral fat. It's not easy to mobilize, but it's there to be a reserve, so to speak, for the body when it needs it.
Which just throws out 99.99% of all, I guess, uninformed recommendations about how people should lose weight.
It's more about the timing of things, right? So if you have a recreational athlete, male or female, and say they want to lose a couple of kilos, primarily body fat, one of the first things that, if they go to a PT or even a coach for some kind of endurance program, they'll be like, hey, let's put in some fasted stuff, right? Or delay your eating. And we'll just do really low intense aerobic stuff to help you burn those calories and get you fat adapted or metabolically efficient. But they're not looking at the picture of the fact that you need fuel in order to hit the intensities and actually allow your body to understand the exercise stress, overcome it, recover from it, and then come down to baseline. Because if you're not allowing your body to have the fuel that it needs to acknowledge that exercise stress and overcome it and adapt to it, then you're not really going to get adaptations. So if you're looking to lose weight, fuel for what you were doing. Don't get up and do a fasted cardio workout or a fast resistance training workout. You already have high cortisol when you wake up. So you're already in that state of kind of like, I'm in that no fuel state, and my body's kind of in that sympathetic drive where, whoa, what's going on? And then you add that increased stress from exercise, and your body's going to stay in that catabolic state and get into that survival mode and put on weight. Whereas if you just fuel just a little bit, I'm not saying have a full meal, but maybe 100 calories, right? Or a little bit of protein, carbohydrate before you go in to bring cortisol down, bring blood sugar up, allow your body to get into the session fueled enough that it can get through those intensity changes, and then you recover with your breakfast. Then the rest of the day, it sets you up in a positive manner to make wise choices. And then at night, you're not eating a big, huge meal because you're starving, which is the misstep, where a lot of people will book in their day of training in the morning, not eat so much, and then boom, starving at night, eat a lot, and they're wondering why they're not losing weight.
Yeah, wow. Just looping back for a moment to the OCP, the oral contraceptive pill, for a female athlete out there that's perhaps starting to consider whether it's their best way to continue to proceed, what advice might you give in terms of consideration to coming off it and what they might experience or expect?
Yeah, so my one consideration is don't do it 3 or 4 months out from the Olympics or any major event. Like, just stay status quo. But if you're looking to come off it, you can come off it whenever. You don't need to taper down. Just stop taking it. But know that your body will take 3 to 4 months to reset, and it could take up to 6 to 8 months to get a natural cycle back. And some women have been on the pill for 10 or 15 years, right? And they've never really ovulated because they've been down-regulated so much. They're facing anovulatory cycles for a few months, a few full cycles after that too. But things will come back to normal relatively quickly. It's just now you've taken these exogenous hormones out and your body's getting used to redoing itself by producing its own hormones.
Which I find are all signposts to the amazing capacity or ability and adaptability of our bodies.
I know. Amazing feat of engineering that I don't think anyone's going to ever really replicate.
Yeah, I mean, I remember being absolutely fascinated at university when we were learning about the collagen, how it's 10,000 times stronger than steel, and I've never forgotten that statistic. I'm like, how? Yeah. That's incredible. Stacey, life phases. women go through, obviously, menopause. There's times of often pregnancy for a female in their lifespan. I know these are big topics, and I must point the listener to get the book raw. You can divulge yourself in there for hours on these topics, but what are the key things you'd share to women out there listening around menopause and time in pregnancy?
So pregnancy, there's not a lot of research out there. It's all anecdotal or case studies. But one of the biggest things for women to realize is that the heart rate guidelines and such are based for sedentary women. If you're already exercising, keep doing what you're doing. It's not like you're going to take up bike racing when you first find out you're pregnant, right?
Yeah. Hope not.
Not, anyway. Because your body will inherently tell you what you can't do. You really cannot go anaerobic when you're pregnant. But the other aspect about it is regular exercise, even though people are like, oh, don't do this, it's hypoxic for the baby. When you're exercising and you have a little bit of that induced hypoxia to the gut and the placenta and that kind of stuff, the rebound of that is increased capillarization to the placenta. So you end up with better vascularization to the growing fetus. We also know from exercise data that you cause some epigenetic changes that are a positive effect for the baby, which will reduce their predisposition for developing childhood and early onset obesity. So there are really good positive effects for exercising. So don't stop unless there's a medical reason to, but also don't pick up something new.
That's it. And I like what you say. You know, you put in your book, your body is smart and so are you. And I think that really removes anxiety, which is an anxious enough time potentially for the first time mother to navigate, let alone having the anxiety around, am I doing the right thing, am I not? So just rest in knowing your body will give you signs.
Yeah, exactly. And the eating thing too, it's not eating for two. It's a small calorie increase every trimester where people are like, oh, I'm going to eat for two. It's like first trimester, you might need around 100 extra calories a day. Then you get into like the 150, 200 calories. And then in the last few months where the baby's really growing, that's where you're looking at 300 to 500 extra calories a day.
So it's less than you might anticipate.
Exactly.
All right, beautiful. Pregnancy, I know there's more. Get the book. Menopause.
Yeah. Oh, how much time do we have? Because that seems to be the biggest population right now. Yeah. I think people are tagging themselves the forgotten athlete, because it's one of the fastest rising populations in sport, really, in recreational sport, is the masters athlete. Yeah. And so there's so many active, competitive menopausal women. They're like, I don't understand what's going on. All the training isn't working for me. So we know that when estrogen and progesterone stop being produced, there's so many basal cell changes and metabolic shifts that you have to change your training and your nutrition in order to keep adapting. So we lose that anabolic stimulus of estrogen for building lean mass. So you need to rely more on a protein dosing and a really strong exercise stimulus to build lean mass. So this is why the new phrase in amongst the Women Are Not Small Men crew is lift heavy shit, because you have to lift a strong enough stimulus, not going to like Les Mills pump class, but you actually have to put that effort into lifting heavy and have a protein dose in order to get that neuromuscular aspect working for you. It also works for bone density too. Like if you're lifting heavy and you're putting that stress, then it preserves bone density. Women in menopause become more carbohydrate sensitive, so insulin response is different. So changing the types of carbohydrates you're eating to more fruit and veg, less of the grains and the processed stuff, and also a switch to more protein and fat rather than just carbohydrate. So there's quite a few nuances to do, and I have ultra runners and Ironman athletes are like, wait, I don't know how to put in high intensity work because I'm training for these ultras. It's like, well, during the week when you're short on time, you lift heavy and you follow by some plyometric work, and then on a weekend or on a Wednesday evening when you have a little bit more time, that's when you put in your long, slow stuff. But if you want to get faster and finish injury-free, you need to change up your training in order to keep your body responding. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for a very slow slog and injury. Yeah,
and we might adapt or adopt, I should say, that lift heavy stuff slogan over for the physiotherapy world, Stacey, because it's a matter of, no, I'm not going to massage your calf. We're going to go to the gym and do some heavy lifting. So
I should quantify it. My husband always is like, lift heavy stuff carefully. I'm like, yes. It has to be with proper form. I'm not going to throw people in doing 100-kilo deadlifts if they can't even do the bar, right?
We are very excited to be hosting our very first physical performance show live event. We are bringing down under none other than, to date, the most downloaded guest of the show, Dr. Stephen Seiler, acclaimed sports scientist and grandfather of the polarized training approach. Dr. Seiler will be presenting a one-day workshop at the Bond University Institute of Sport and Health on the Gold Coast on the 19th of July 2020. The workshop is titled Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals. Dr. Seiler will explore intensity distribution, interval training, periodization, and monitoring. This event will sell out. There is a limit of 100 attendees, and it is ideal for coaches, athletes, health and medical professionals, fitness professionals, students, or anyone that values pursuing their own physical best. To find out more about the event or to book your ticket from a low $197, but wait, as a listener of the show, you can receive 10% off at the checkout simply by using the coupon code TPPS. Jump over to pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Seiler, Seiler. For now, let's jump back with Dr. Stacy Sims on this an expert edition exploring all things female physiology and endurance training. There's some great listener questions here, Stacey, that have come through. But just before we jump onto those, one of the things I found fascinating in finishing Raw was that women there's a ratio 5 times more likely to experience gastrointestinal upset or distress than men. So what can you share around that, Stacey, for the athlete out there that's, say, taking on an endurance challenge, perhaps a first-time marathon or an Ironman event or iron distance event?
Yeah, it's a couple of tier effects. So estrogen does perturb the junction in the intestine. So the more estrogen you have, the more predisposed you are to leaky gut. But the big factor, especially in engineered nutrition and sport nutrition, is the amount of fructose that is in there. So you look at a lot of the research that's been done, they're like maltodextrin, fructose, glucose combinations are the best way because you get a lower osmolality hit and you get several different sugars. But when you look, all that research has been done on men, and from a physiological perspective, women cannot absorb as much fructose as men. So they get this fructose dump in their gut, and the response is more water coming from other places in the body to reduce the pressure of that fructose. And you get this incredible amount buildup of fructose, and it's called a brush border effect, where the gates are trying to pull the fructose across. There's not enough gates to respond to it, so it just sits there and causes this gut irritation, and the response is diarrhea, gas, bloating, that kind of stuff. So the best advice I can give people who are getting into endurance sport is don't rely on engineered nutrition, eat real food, because you can tailor what kind of intensity and duration you're doing and the food that you're eating to match and eliminate that GI distress.
And practically, I mean, it's going to be individual to the person in front of you, the athlete, but also the goal of the event. But, you know, I read there that not relying on the sports drinks, but looking at a drink of just glucose and sucrose. So would it be making up your own, or what would you suggest? There's
a relatively new niche in sport nutrition of the functional hydration drinks. So you have the Scratches, you have SOS Hydrate, you have the Noon Endurance. So all of these are your lower carbohydrate, higher electrolyte formulas, and they're specifically engineered to work with your physiology. So they're glucose, sucrose, for maximum fluid absorption. And people always counter me on the sucrose because they're like, wait, sucrose breaks down into glucose and fructose, and you're saying no fructose, but it's rate limited. So your body's like, oh, okay, I can handle a little bit more fructose, so I will hydrolyze the sucrose so I can have a little bit of glucose, a little bit of fructose. So you're never overwhelming any of those transport mechanisms at one time. And that's the key that a lot of people forget. And then you'll have some people who are so used to using engineered nutrition, they'll use it in training, they'll use it in racing, and then they keep wondering why they have so much GI distress. And when you're looking at the gut microbiome and you're putting the gut under heat and hypoxic stress during exercise, because you have blood flow diversion, you have increased body temperature, and then you're feeding that bacteria simple sugar, then the bacteria that grows and thrives on simple sugars will grow and overgrow. And most of the time, the metabolites of these phyla are ones that promote endotoxin and leaky gut. So you're not doing yourself any justice either if you keep using these in training and racing.
So it seems like less can be more. And, we know around hydration, drink to thirst, take the overthought out of it and almost just trust the basics. Would that be a fair summary?
Yep.
Or is that too simplified?
The drink to thirst thing is a bit simplified because it only works in the low hormone phase.
Okay.
In the high hormone phase, your thirst sensation is muted because you have a baseline threshold shift where your plasma osmolality is sitting right on the cusp of hyponatremia. And so your body isn't going to encourage you to bring in fluid. So you need to just remind yourself, have a little alarm, sip, sip, sip along the way. But in the low hormone phase, it's okay because we're more like men and we're not quite close to hyponatremia.
So high hormone phase, sip, sip, sip. Low hormone phase,
thirst.
Yeah.
Natural. Yeah.
Brilliant. Stacey, this has been fascinating. There's a few listener questions that have come through out of many. I've just screened a couple here that jumped out. There was a few repetitive themes. The first is any info around special exercise nutrition requirements during breastfeeding. I know some of these we may have loosely touched on already.
Yeah, so the biggest thing about breastfeeding is making sure that you are getting enough calories and support you, the development of the milk, and your exercise aspects. So, the typical pumping before you exercise so that the baby doesn't get an off taste of milk. And when you're thinking about not having things transferred in the milk to the baby, just eat low on the food chain, eat real food, protect the gut microbiome by eating a wide variety of diverse, colorful fruit and veg, and you're good to go. There's no real special magic touch that you have to worry about when you're breastfeeding, other than if you're starting to take supplements, if you're looking at ergogenic aids, just avoid them because there's not enough data out there to show what the effect would be because, the supplement industry isn't that well regulated. So we don't even know the effect of a lot of these in a single human, let alone a woman who's breastfeeding.
Yeah, wow, so interesting. Stacey, final listener question here. Any tips if racing in the premenstrual phase?
So that was technically the high hormone or the late luteal phase.
Yep.
And this is where there are a few things to do. So we're aware of what happens there, where we have reset and we're closer to hyponatremia. Our core temperature is higher. We can't access carbohydrate very well. So an intervention on race day is you're doing like salting your food during the taper week. You can look at preloading with a sodium fluid load like miso soup, chicken soup the night before, or using some of the products like the hyperhydrations or the right stuff. So you're getting that fluid and sodium load. Having some branched chain amino acids because the leucine in those counter estrogen in the brain because tryptophan, serotonin, and leucine all use the same, transfer or carrier protein, and leucine is preferred. So if you can get leucine across the brain, then you reduce the brain fog, you get your mojo back. And then making sure that you're using quick hits of carbohydrate along the way to top up the blood sugar so you can maintain pace.
So there are some very practical things, and they're just the bullet points, but that's great. And then final question, if we can sneak one in, recovery. How does recovery different based on high and low hormone phases, or does it?
It's more a sex difference.
Okay.
So we know that women return to baseline a lot faster than men. So our window for nutrition is a lot smaller. Resistance training, the research out there is hit or miss on whether you have to pay attention to that protein timing window because you don't completely deplete. But in the endurance phase, you're completely depleting and you need to get that protein in and then some carbohydrate. So usually within 30 to 40 minutes after you finish the session. And then things like cold water immersion, there's all these things, it doesn't work because the data's been done on men. And there's a blood pressure difference between men and women post-exercise. So post-exercise, women vasodilate, and that's why they get that orthostatic hypotension, the lightheadedness, because all their blood goes to the periphery. Whereas men, they vasoconstrict, and all of it goes centrally, so they don't get the same effect. So cold water immersion post-exercise works really well for women because it creates that vasoconstriction, sends the blood back centrally to encourage the recovery.
Fascinating. And therein again, I guess, brings up that whole cultural element you mentioned. A lot of what we know has been to date done on cohorts of men in research, and forgetting that 50% plus of the population's women.
Yeah. No.
little bit of an oversight. Stacey, there is so much you've shared, and there's so much more you could share. I'm going to give you perhaps the most difficult question for someone like yourself, and that's if you could condense everything you've learnt across your own learnings, your own journey as an athlete, your PhD, your work at Stanford, everything else, to one piece of advice to help the listener of this show perform at their best, what's it going to be from Dr. Stacy Sims?
Pay attention to yourself. Like, learn inherently how you respond, how you feel, because now we're in that era, everyone's tracking stuff, and people have lost that art of what how do I feel? How does this make me feel? So when you come in tuned, that's pretty much all the work that I've done across the board is making people become more in tune with themselves. And it's taken a long time for myself to learn that too. Like, you don't need a sleep tracker to know you didn't get really good sleep, right? But so many people are using it. And it can be beneficial, but for the most part, intuition.
Yeah, and trust yourself. Your body's smart, right, as you say.
Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant. And I think it's beautiful that sometimes Expert Edition's one piece of advice is, overlaps. So Shona Halson, a recovery scientist from Australia, shared the same thing. All the gadgets, all the measurables, but come back to listen to your body.
Yeah.
How edifying to hear that now from yourself as well. Stacey, a physical challenge for the week. Every guest issues one to listeners. What's Dr. Stacey Sims' physical challenge of the week going to be?
So as much as I hate them, I've been doing them because I'm trying to put more plyo and high intensity into my life. So the physical challenge is, you know how you number the days of the week, like Monday is 1 and Tuesday is 2. Maybe it's an American thing, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 10 burpees per number. So it's 10, then 20, then 30, then 40, then 50, then 60, then 70 burpees.
Every week? Well, but this is a weekly challenge, so it's going to be for 1 week. So you're going to end up with 70 burpees on the 7th day.
Yes.
Well,
10 on the first, 20 on the second, 30 on the third, 40 on the fourth, 50 on the fifth. Yep, you got it. 70 on the seventh.
So we're going to call this the Dr. Stacey Sims weekly burpee challenge. How's that fit?
That works.
That works. Now, Stacey, you have a lot going on. Your online course, you've got your travel packs, which made their way into the, was it the Oscars or the Grammys?
Oscars, yeah.
Oscars. You've got your epigenetics work company, genetic testing. There is just so much. I assume another book at some point.
Yep.
So,
catering to the peri and postmenopausal woman.
Beautiful. Yeah. So how can the listener follow your journey, find out more? What's the best way to do that?
Web and social media are all Dr. Stacy Sims. So any one of those, you can keep up with what I'm doing.
Yeah, and you publish some great stuff there. And that's STACYSIMS, just to make sure we get the spelling right. But I'm sure you pop up even if the spelling's misspelt.
Yeah, maybe.
You're prolific. I'm sure there's that picks you up as well. Stacey, thank you for your time. You're in demand, and your sharings have been so rich.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show. And I trust and I know you took a lot from today's episode and the sharings of Dr. Stacy Sims. Now, if you did, then a big favour, please stop what you're doing and share the episode link with someone. SMS it, send it in Messenger, email it, whatever it is, but please share the learnings. It's important that this information does reach more people. I wholeheartedly agree with Dr. Stacy Sims. It is high time that we stop, in the world of sport, treating women like small men. Now, if you are also yet to read Dr. Stacy's book, Raw, R-O-A-R, then I recommend picking up a copy of it. It is a fantastic read. It is not just for female athletes, but anyone that values or works within the sphere of physical performance. You'll find Raw available anywhere where good books are sold. Now, there were plenty of learnings from today's episode, but here are my top 3. Number 1, female athletes need to work with and not against their natural physiology. Simply understanding and appreciating the physiological differences between the high hormone phase and the low hormone phase can direct and influence all manners of female athletic performance. Learning number 2. Female athletes can offset many side effects of the high hormone phase, that is, approximately day 15 to 28 of the menstruation cycle, through diet, such as protein timing and hydration, meaning that a female athlete's period can really be an ergogenic aid. Learning number 3. And it has been a recurring theme from many of the featured expert edition guests, and that is, female athletes need to fuel for the work required. Be very wary of fad diets, cutting carbs out, and intermittent fasting. By understanding the differences physiologically between the high and low hormone phase, fueling for the female athlete can be optimized, and therefore so can performance. Now, if you did take learnings from today's episode, then please reach out and let Dr. Stacy Sims know what jumped out at you. You'll find Stacy over on Instagram at Dr. Stacy Sims, STACYSIMS. Don't forget to keep the podsies coming. That is a screenshot of the episode you are enjoying at any given moment in time, and tagging in the show at Physical Performance Show and myself at Brad_Beer, and we will reshare your podsie. Now, don't forget the Physical Performance Show Facebook page, where you can leave questions for featured guests that we will do our best to get answered following episode going live. A massive thanks to those who have been leaving ratings and reviews over on iTunes, and also hitting subscribe to the show. Subscribing ensures the episodes land in your earbuds each and every week as the episodes go live on a Thursday evening. A massive thanks, as always, to the 3 very good folk who make the show possible week in, week out. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Walding on all things show graphic design. Another huge thanks to today's show sponsor, Physiocrem. Physiocrem is the cream of choice at Pogo Physio. And don't forget, they have generously offered up 20% off the entire range by using the coupon code POGO, POGO, over at their online store, physiocrem.com.au. Of course, don't forget to check out our upcoming live event featuring Dr. Stephen Seiler, a one-day workshop held on the Gold Coast, Saturday the 18th of July, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Sustainable training for attainable endurance goals. You'll find that over at pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Seiler, Seiler. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we jump over to the track, and I'll share with you a conversation that I recently had with featured performer Peter Boll. Peter Boll is an Australian track and field athlete on the rise. He's the current Australian 800-metre champion, boasts a top 5 all-time Australian 800-metre personal best, 144.56, represented Australia at the Rio Olympic Games in 2016 off the back of just 5 years of time in the sport of athletics. Peter has quite the story, immigrating from Sudan to Egypt at the age of 6, before then immigrating once again from Egypt to Australia at 10 years of age. Peter grew up wanting to be a basketballer, but soon discovered that his true talent lay on the track. So tune in next week for Peter Boll's highs, lows, and learnings from his career to date. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.